Hey guys, and welcome back to the Yes It Means Yes podcast. My name is Faith Nomshiff, and I am the ARP Outreach and Counseling Coordinator with Rape Counselors of East Alabama. I'm here this week to talk with Brittany Braswell about eating disorders and kind of how those may intersect with sexual violence. So I'm going to go ahead and let her introduce herself, and we can kind of go from there. Brittany?
Right. Thank you so much for having me, Faith. I know this is a hard subject for a lot of people to talk about, so I'm honored to be able to have this conversation with you today, and just to help listeners get to know me a little bit better. I am a registered dietitian. I practice from a non-diet, weight-neutral standpoint, so that means that the clients that come to work with me know that there is no judgment or assumptions that I am making about your physical or mental health based on your body weight, shape, or size. So that is my passion. I primarily work with women as well as some men that struggle with disordered eating, maybe diagnosed eating disorders, and negative body image. And then my sort of subspecialty with that, for those who want it, is really kind of like the Christ-centered, faith-based approach. So I work with a variety of college age students and up, and really just love to serve them and help them repair their relationship with food and their body.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we appreciate, you being able to come on and share your expertise. So we're going to kind of take it back to the basics. For any listeners out there who may not be as familiar, what is an eating disorder?
So, an eating disorder is really a really debilitating mental health condition, and it manifests itself as behavioral struggles and physical symptoms that have to do with your food and body related thoughts. So, most of the time, an eating disorder is going to be characterized by really severe and persistent disturbances in your eating patterns or behaviors. And almost all the time, there's going to be some sort of associated distress when it comes to your thoughts and your emotions around food. So, I think one of the biggest misconceptions I hear when someone talks about an eating disorder is that they just say, oh, well, somebody just needs to eat less or eat more. And an eating disorder is a very specific disease or condition. It's not just something that's a bad habit or something that you can just quote unquote fix by changing your
Hmm.
eating habits. And so
Hmm.
it is something that requires very intentional treatment. And unfortunately, it eating disorders have one of the highest morbidity and mortality rates,
Hmm.
second only to opioid use and overdose. So I know that's kind of a heavy way to like already jump in, but I think it's so important to know that struggles around food and body image are so valid, and that
Hmm.
if you have an anxiety ridden relationship with food or your body, that it deserves to be talked about and addressed.
Awesome. And, we are kind of in a similar boat in that it's hard to talk about, but, that's why people like you and me are here because someone's got to talk about it, right? Because it's happening.
It is happening. Yeah. A
Hmm.
lot more than
Hmm.
people realize. Yeah.
Yep, yep. Okay, so based on your own experience, how do you go about treating disorders? Just give me a kind of a background of, just your experience in general with treating eating disorders or working with those clients.
Yeah, so my experience, I kind of tailor. I have a private practice now. I have worked in the lots of different levels of care. So with the treatment of eating disorders, you have inpatient level. So that would be in a
Mm-hmm.
hospital kind of setting where you might need a lot of supervision, medical stability, and then there's still medical level of treatment, but residential or partial programs. And so that would be where someone comes in and they either have 24/7 access to support, or maybe they're there during the day for a day program and then maybe they go home at night. So I've been in all of those settings. I'm now in private practice where I see my clients once a week, sometimes twice a month, depending. And really the approach that I take with a lot of clients is we're incorporating body image work, depending on the client and the location, sometimes medical nutrition therapy, which would really involve looking at potential deficiencies and making recommendations specific to treat malnourishment or inadequate intake of certain types of nutrients. We're also providing a lot of education and coaching. So, looking at, I'll have people come to me all the time, and you probably hear a similar type thing in the work that you do, Faith, where someone will say, Brittany, I know what I need to do, or I have this thing that I
Mm-hmm.
really want to do. I want to change this behavior, but I can't do it, or I
Yeah.
can't figure out how to do it, or I have no idea why I can't seem to do it. And so there's a lot of implementation and support that we put around that. I'm going, hey, here's the goal. So let's back up and let's put a game plan together for how to achieve that. And I'm going to give you the accountability that you need to make it happen. So that's a lot of what my current work looks like. And like I said, for those clients that want it, we have a lot of faith related discussions in that. I know we're going to talk a lot about sexual trauma today, but
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes there's some spiritual related trauma there too. And so I really like to take a holistic approach as much as possible and collaborate with therapists, psychologists, anyone else that might be on the treatment team for that particular person.
Okay. Um, so when you're working with individuals who have developed an eating disorder, is there any particular group that you would say develops eating disorders? Like who are these people? Is there any demographic, any specific thing?
So eating disorders do not discriminate. Absolutely anybody can develop disordered eating or even leading into a full-blown eating disorder. It is most definitely not limited to a specific sex, gender, age, life stage. Um, we see different statistics with diagnoses, but there's
Okay.
also a lot of people have a hard time getting diagnosed or get misdiagnosed because unfortunately there's a lot of weight stigma. So
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes a physician may diagnose things like binge eating disorder more frequently because with the weight stigma unfortunately that we have today, if someone is in a larger body size, a lot of physicians especially will assume, okay, well, you struggle with overeating. Or if they see
Mm-hmm.
someone who is in a smaller body size than they feel like is appropriate, they may automatically say, hey, you have anorexia. And there's so many different types of struggles. There's really
Mm-hmm.
only about 6% of people with eating disorders are actually medically diagnosed as underweight. And so I think it's really helpful just to, if you feel like you struggle with disordered eating, or maybe you have people around you that you've noticed, please don't discount your anxiety or struggles around food because you feel like you don't meet a specific criteria for body weight or shape or size. So yes, they definitely don't discriminate. We see them in lots of different types of populations, but definitely there's an increase. There's probably three major factors that increase your chances or development of disordered eating, and definitely trauma falls into one of those.
Okay. And I think you kind of touched on something that we see a lot, which is there's these ideas that either media portrays, society portrays, we've been told our whole lives of what someone who is a rape victim looks like. And I'm sure with eating disorders, there's an idea of what someone with an eating disorder looks like. And it's typically that, you know, younger female who looks emaciated. With us, very kind of similar. Like typically, people think of a rape victim as a young adult who is female, um, probably in college or around that age, and there's alcohol involved. Like there's these ideas that have been pushed for so long that's it really hinders some of the work we can do because then we have individuals who 100% meet that criteria because but they're not looking at themselves the same as what they think it should be. So then they're like, oh, this
Right.
can't be me.
Yep. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So don't invalidate your struggle because you don't
Mm-hmm.
think you meet a specific set of um, stigma or
Mm-hmm.
what you perceive as criteria, for sure.
Right, right. What the victim of this should look like or not look like. Yes. Um,
Mhm.
so going off of that, why are eating disorders developed? How are they developed?
Yeah, so a minute ago, I mentioned that there's like sort of three umbrella categories that I
Mhm,
see a lot that really contribute to a lot of the underlying causes of the development of disordered eating. The first
mhm,
one is biological factors. So there are things to consider like genetics,
mm, mhm,
personality, family history, even various types of disabilities, um, learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder. There's all types of biological related factors that significantly increase your risk for disordered eating development. Um, I probably should have the statistics memorized on this, but it's something like uh, 7 times you're 7 times more likely to develop anorexia if you have, like, a mom, sister, aunt, close relative, and then something like, I wanna say 13 or 14 times more likely, for bulimia or maybe even binge eating. So,
mm,
I think it's important to not assume that genetics is the major component, but there's so much that can happen from a family history perspective just to consider and be aware of, because there's probably a lot
mhm,
that you grew up observing in your home, or within your family, maybe even certain types of personality traits. I have a lot of a lot of clients that struggle with that will say like I'm very type A, very perfectionistic. I have these certain types of tendencies, and those are not the only ones, but those are some traits that might
mm,
make it more likely that you might struggle with some very restrictive habits, or maybe even over exercise related habits. So, biological factors, that's a big one. Another big one I see a lot is cultural factors. So, this is going to vary culture to culture, but in ours today, in your typical Western culture in the US, we know media influences a lot. Social media, radio type media, movies. We get this idea on what eating disorders are, what thin and beautiful equals, happy, and huge misperception there. We
mhm,
see a lot on fad diets and comparison and various definitions of what people think the perfect body should be, or if you're healthy, this is what this looks like. So, so many different types of cultural or societal influences can contribute to eating disorder development. And then the one that we'll probably dive into the most today is life stressors, and that includes things like trauma, loss, even things like frequently moving, like having to start over a lot, bullying. Maybe you were the bully, or maybe you've been bullied. A
mm,
variety of illnesses, right? That either maybe left you feeling isolated, um, or that changed your level of connection with other people, and similarly things like loneliness, when you feel like you're really stressed and feel really disconnected because maybe you have people around, but maybe you're not close with people. Maybe you kind of keep people at an arm's length. So there's a lot of those different life stressors that can be major contributing factors to eating disorder development.
mhm. So it kind of sounds like, you know, there's no one real culprit, and it just kind of varies depending on who you are, where you are, what you're going through.
Yeah, it absolutely does, and I think it's good to take inventory of all of those
Mhm,
areas. For one person, they may have one or two factors that are their major contributing factors, or maybe they've had a lot of things add up, and then there's this one major precipitating event that really just kind of
mm,
triggers the downfall. So it's good to look at all of these areas and see how they've impacted or influenced you, and then be able to back it up, hopefully working hand in hand with a therapist or counselor to go, okay, where did these beliefs originate, and how did this start and then build over time to lead to the behaviors.
So obviously, we are coming from a perspective of being a rape crisis center, right? So we do deal with a lot of individuals who either have just recently experienced some sort of sexual violence or had sexual abuse growing up in one way or form or another, right? Um, so, in your experience, would you say that there's a correlation between eating disorders and sexual violence, or statistically?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Sexual trauma and disordered eating are often comorbid. type struggles.
Mm-hmm.
And so comorbidity, meaning like you have the presence of two, maybe underlying factors that are happening commonly or at the same time. And disordered eating is very often associated with sexual trauma because it often develops as an attempt to cope. So some type of
Mm-hmm.
unhealthy coping mechanism in order to deal with the trauma on some level. And research supports this a lot. I think it's something like 30% of those who struggle with disordered eating have experienced some sort of sexual abuse, often in childhood, um, and maybe even since. So we see this a lot. It shows up in a lot of different ways, and some people I think this is one that unless someone feels really safe in talking about it, we may not always know that sexual trauma of any sort at
Yeah.
a lot of different levels have influenced the desire, or I shouldn't say the desire, but the development of disordered eating. And some people even have a hard time recognizing that, hey, this was one of the triggering factors, that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's hard to connect those in your mind, or even to recognize that you do maybe struggle with disordered eating, because we live in such a diet culture infused society today that so many types of disordered eating behaviors are glorified,
Mm-hmm.
and so so it's if you have struggled, or if you have experienced sexual trauma of any sort, I think that's a really I think it's really important just to do a little check-in and evaluation and see what does your relationship with food look like, because there's a pretty high risk of that contributing to some type of unhealthy relationship with food or your body.
Mm-hmm. So, why do you think someone who has experienced sexual violence or, any trauma in general, why do you think that those are so comorbid occurring with eating disorders?
Well, with sexual trauma, it's often going to lead a person to the desire to disconnect from their body.
Mm-hmm.
Something happened to them that they don't want to be connected with their body because maybe it feels unsafe, or it feels just really uncomfortable to even focus on it. And so when we get disconnected with our body, we lose a lot of signals. We It's really hard to recognize things like hunger and fullness and satisfaction. Oftentimes satisfaction feels like this isn't okay, like I don't deserve this. And so there's usually a lot of negative self-talk that happens with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that that desire to disconnect from the body is a big one. The other one that really goes right alongside this, maybe even kind of underneath that umbrella, is that the eating disorder might develop in order to meet a need that's currently unmet.
Okay.
So I see there's probably 6 or 7 needs that I see come up most in my practice, but I would say there's 4, um, 4 of the 7 that more relate, or that I see correlate a lot in those who have had some type of sexual abuse or trauma. Um, First one being that desire to feel in control of their body
Mhm,
when maybe
mhm,
something out of their control happened to it. So, it feels really unsafe oftentimes to feel like something is out of your control. And so if you experience some sort of sexual abuse and you feel like, hey, this thing happened that I had no say so in, then I'm going to take back control of my body by, choosing to eat this or not, or when, or how much.
mhm,
So control is a big one. Um, Another need that is often left unmet, that can lead to development of disordered eating, is repressing or numbing out. So if you need to repress feelings, it's a lot harder to mentally connect with what's going on when you are physically deprived, or when you are consuming in excess, right? So this could go for binging, restricting, or really anywhere in between. If it's something physical that you have to focus on that numbs you out, or represses some of those really uncomfortable feelings. Um, a third one that I've seen a lot, and I think this one doesn't get enough credence sometimes, is it can often be a means of like self punishment. I've
mhm,
had a lot of clients that have said, um, I just have so much anger, and I feel like I'm angry about what happened. I don't have anyone to take it out on. And so I'm kind of just punishing myself for this thing that I feel like is my fault. And sometimes that is a means, like restriction happens because of that. Like they deprive themselves as a means of punishment. And sometimes it's, I'm going to make myself, physically uncomfortable with the amount of food I eat, or going a certain amount of time without eating and then eating a lot. And so there's this back and forth.
Mhm.
Um, so self punishment, or kind of that need to take out anger, is another one. And then the last one I'll point out kind of for today is, and we've touched on this some already, Faith, is like that need for safety.
Yeah.
Um, I see this in a lot of clients that have had some sort of sexual trauma, because when you change, if changing or sustaining a particular body size, like maybe that's different than the size they were at the time of their abuse,
Mhm.
feels safer, that happens a lot. So if something happened when they were in a smaller body size, they may feel a lot safer being at a higher weight or a different shape, because that's a different body than when the abuse happened. And this can happen, it may be a larger or smaller body that might make you feel more safe. And maybe I've had clients that say, I feel like I need to take up less space, right?
Mm,
Or I feel
mhm.
like in a certain body size, I'm not as easily noticed, or people don't pay attention to me as much or as often, and that
Mhm.
feels safer because I don't like the attention.
Mhm.
So that need for safety is a really, really, really big one, really common one, in those who have had some sort of sexual trauma or abuse.
Mm. Yeah, I was, as you were kinda going through them and just, looking over the questions and things, very often, I think I see the control one, working with my clients just because it's like almost, "This was something I could not control, this I can control,
Mhm.
and so this is what I'm going to control." Um, and that's definitely been something that I have kinda seen over and over. I'm just working with anyone, who has disordered eating, after any sort of, like, sexual violence or something. So, I it I mean, it makes sense, and we talk a lot about control too and power in just our line of work, because when someone is assaulted, right, their power is completely taken away, and oftentimes that leaves survivors grasping onto anything that will allow them some sense of control, and unfortunately, that does sometimes lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms. So I'm glad that you mentioned that and you brought that up. Those fulfilling the need one, I think, is something we very, very often see. So I'm glad that you were able to kind of like break that down, because it makes so much sense.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what happens so often, Faith, that the people who are struggling with disordered eating don't realize is that it feels in control at first, and then
Mm-hmm.
it really becomes this false sense of control, because eventually the eating disorder thoughts are really what takes over. And they're not your
Mm-hmm.
thoughts anymore. They're this need to meet certain criteria or standards, or you end up oftentimes setting these rules for yourself and these self-imposed consequences for not, and you end up really being more of a slave to the eating disorder than actually in control yourself. So that's something I think is really necessary and helpful to work on with your therapist, dietitian, recovery coach, whoever you
Mm-hmm.
might be collaborating with, because it's not bad to have control, right? Like we don't want to feel out of control all the time. But it's also really impactful to recognize, what can you control? What can't you control?
Mm-hmm.
How can you adapt to those things you can't control? And then, are there some things that you are controlling that you maybe really don't need to control, or they're
Mm-hmm.
not
Mm-hmm.
helpful or beneficial for you to control? So that can be a really hard subject or conversation to have, but it can be so beneficial in opening the door to some more freedom in that area.
Mm-hmm. It's, just like coping skills in general, you have to walk a very fine line of a healthy coping skill veering off into that unhealthy coping, right? Because
Yeah, absolutely.
focusing on what you can control, awesome, great. Making things that you shouldn't be able to control, not so great. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I definitely think, anyone, struggling with something like this, great advice working with a therapist, a dietitian, a recovery coach, a life coach, whoever it is that you feel like is going to work with you to develop those healthy coping mechanisms and learn how to work through trauma without having to have control, um, or a need or whatever it may be.
Mhm.
So that's good. Um, Brittany, I really appreciated just having you on. I feel like I learned a lot today just about, eating disorders and kind of the correlation that it has with the line of work that I do. And I hope that, anyone listening out there was able to understand a little bit more themselves. Is there anything else that you feel like you need to say or want to mention just specifically about the topic?
So, Faith, what I would say is number one, like your needs are valid, right? That
Mm-hmm.
when we have needs that we need met, you can absolutely there are ways to get those needs met in a life-giving way. And if you do have a disordered relationship with food or with your body, that it's not your fault. It's not that you just woke up one day and said, "Hey, I think I'll just start doing this thing that's negatively going to impact my physical and mental health." Right? You
Mm-hmm.
we learn we pick up these means of coping to deal with something that's been really difficult, and it
Mm-hmm.
feels effective, but it's also not the only way. So, um, what might feel like a solution when it comes to trying to control your food or to manipulate your body weight or shape really just ends up creating more problems, and it's not a
Mm-hmm.
sustainable way to meet those needs. So my encouragement would be talk to someone safe, because if you're experiencing some shame or guilt around your relationship with food or your body, shame grows in darkness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But freedom is possible when you open up. So you don't have to open up to everybody. You don't have to, wear your heart on your sleeve, but find somebody that you can talk to and really dive in to those needs and trying to figure out what needs do you need met. Um, I get this kind of question so often. I just put together a free resource, so I'm happy to send you the link if anybody wants. I just call it the needs assessment. It's nice and simple. And you can grab that off of my website. It's a absolutely free downloadable resource. And that's at brittanybraswellrd.com/needs. And it goes through, it's kind of like a quiz style download. And you can just ask yourself the different sort of fill in the blank kind of questions to really help you figure out what of the 7 needs. I know we went over 4 of them today, but of the 7, which ones might different behaviors be meeting for you right now? And some of them might
Mm-hmm.
be specific to food, and some of them might be different. Um, so I think that's a great next step if you recognize that maybe you do struggle with some disordered eating, or you have these food or body related behaviors that you really want to change or you want to look different. That can be a really great next step and resource.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that great message to those out there who may be struggling. And for anyone listening, that resource that she mentioned, I'm going to get that from Brittany and going to leave it in the link, the box below, whether it's YouTube or Spotify or wherever you're listening, in the description box so that you can have that resource as well. Is there anything else that you want to cover, Brittany, or you think that's it? Any other resources?
Um, well, I know we could probably talk for hours, Faith. So I'll wrap us up. Other than just to say, if this conversation left you feeling like maybe you have some more questions and you want to talk about it, feel free to shoot me an
Mhm.
Instagram message. I can't provide counseling in a DM, but I'm happy to send you some resources or give you some support there. And y'all can find me on Instagram just at Brittany Braswell RD.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again for sharing that. And I'll put all that information she provided below for the listeners. Brittany, thank you again for joining us, and sharing about, what you do and how beneficial it can be to the work of ending sexual violence and ending, the devastating effects that it has and aiding your recovery. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work that you do. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.